So welcome to episode 4 in our learning series, and this time I'm going to show you how to make that wonderful flying splash around the path animation you just have seen. And I would say let's start. Here we go. I already prepared something, and this is I have my basic scene here, and there's a can. Of course you can choose any model you would like to see, so take a cup, a glass or a bottle or whatever. I found this free 3D model on the web. There was already some UV data, and there was a texture. I loaded this texture and yes, edited it to look like what you can see here. And so this is what I prepared. And I would say just prepare the scene, and the next step we will prepare the simulation, and after that we're going to prepare the rendering. Alright, so let's start with this. When you have your model here and you have set up your texture and your shaders and whatever thing is needed, the next step is let's take a look to what we're going to do here. We need HD resolution. I will render it with 100% later, and we're going to use 25 frames per second as I'm in Germany or Europe. And if you're in the United States or what else, you will choose a frame rate that matches your home country or whatever. But it is not really required, just to make that ready for simulation and for your animation. And let's go on here. So we have our model here, and there's nothing else. There's a camera, there's our model, our can or whatever, and there's no light source now. So that means when we take a look in the rendered view, we just see this here, and yes, that looks a little bit too flat for me. So what is really required is an HDRI environment texture to bring some very nice reflections on your model, as well as on the fluid surface when simulation has been finished. And I found out a good source for HDRI images is an example. The webpage from Ice Clots. He has some really cool free HDRI images, and the one I'm going to use is I think it was Forest, yes, Forest, Street, Schwarztalsperre. I've chosen this one because it is very bright, and you can see in the preview thumbnail here how shadows will look like, how reflections will look like, and refractions will look like, and that is the one I'm going to use now in our scene. But it's a thing of you, what you would like to see, and choose something here. I just will say thank you Ice Clouds for all that great free HDRIs, so take a look to this. Alright, so when you have chosen your HDRI image, you have to link it to Blender. So I'm doing it in the Word tab. I activate use nodes. Note that I'm in rendered preview here to see what's happening. And when you have the background here, click on that small dot in the color panel here and click on the environment texture. Now we have that pink here, what is really stupid. And we have to open our image. I've downloaded it here, and I'm choosing the 4K texture because it is very nice quality. And when I open it, you will see how great my can is looking like. And I will make it a little bit more strong, so it is a little bit brighter, and that looks really fantastic. So this is my basic model for this animation, and I'm really sure what model you ever have chosen for this scene with the right HDRI image, you will love the result. Okay, so let's go on in preparing the scene. We have our model here, and what we now would need is a path where our fluid will fly around. So to do this, press Shift A on your keyboard, select curve, select path, and then I would say go to the top view by pressing 7 key on the numbers keypad on your keyboard, and then switch to the edit mode. And let's make the path look like what we would like to have here. Okay, so you can click on a point, press G on the keyboard to move it. When you are on top view, you will only move on the X and Y axis. Okay, and now while pressing E, you can add new points and draw your path around your object. I would say make 2 rounds around your object. So we have something like this here. Okay. So this is the basic path, and it is flat. Yes, we need to make it go upwards to the top of your model, and I found out a good way to do it is while being in edit mode, select all points and deselect or unselect the first point and move all points a little bit up, deselect the next point, move up, deselect the next point, move up, and so on. Okay, great. So I finished this and it's looking like this, and of course you can make some corrections while being in any view. So let's say I would love to make that points a little bit smaller here while being in top view. Just press S to scale, so it's looking like this. And of course, when you are in object mode and press S on your keyboard, you can scale in the Z or in any other direction to make that match like your idea in your head. Okay, so the path has been finished yet, and I'm going to rename it, let's say path 1, and this is a path where our inflow object will fly around. But for this kind of simulation, we need also a second object, an obstacle that will follow our inflow and break the fluid surface. So we have some nice drops that flying around, and we need to delay the movement of that obstacle object. It should be behind the inflow, and this is possible by using a second path. So what we can do is press Shift D on our keyboard. That makes it duplicate, and just press Enter. No need to move it anywhere. It should be exact on the first path here, and then I'm going to rename it, call it path number 2, and I'm sorry, path number 2. So, and we are ready to go. Okay, so let's add the inflow object. I'm going to use a simple UV sphere, make it some smaller here, and we have to bring it near the beginning of the path, which still is here. A little bit more down, scale it a little bit smaller. I would say something like that should work. And now while your inflow object, or let's call it inflow, is selected, hit Shift on your keyboard and also select path number 1. And now hit Ctrl and P, and you can parent your inflow object to the path, and you can tell Blender now it should follow the path. And by doing this, Blender automatically makes a path animation for your inflow. So press Alt A, and you will see your inflow object is flying around your mesh. This is really beautiful, really cool. While the path is selected, you can go to the object data here, and then you can find path animation panel here, and you see frames 100, what means the interpolation of the movement is on 100 frames, and you can increase the number to say, let's say 250 frames, and then the sphere will need 250 frames to finish the whole movement. Okay, so far so good. You see another thing, there's evaluation time here set to 1, and as you can see, it automatically increases with each frame. And this is because when you parent an object as path animation, Blender will automatically generate a generator, a mathematical operation that calculates all frames plus 1. And there's no way to keyframe that here to delay it, but I can show you a trick how to do it, because this is required for the obstacle that follows our inflow object. So while your inflow object is selected, press Shift S to snap the cursor and say snap cursor to selected. So now we can add a new mesh, and that will be exactly on the same place where our cursor is. And I'm going to use a cone because I found in my experiments out that it is a great mesh to break fluids. And let's rotate this a little bit. I'll scale it some down. I'm going to the top view and take a look what the rotation says. So let's make sure it is big enough to to come through the inflow object, because we want to break the fluids. And I would say that looks fantastic. And I'm going to call that fluids breaker. And while your fluids breaker, and while this one is selected, press Shift on your keyboard and also select path 2. And again, press Ctrl and P, follow path, set the frames to 252 and play the animation. You will see both are moving exactly the same. And now we need to delay the movement of our breaker object. And that's really cool. While only path 2 is selected, go to the graphs editor, and then you will have that plus here. You can open a panel here and go to the modifiers tab here, and then you will find the mathematical operation Blender automatically added. And you have that one here, what means one additional frame per scene frame. And this is our start value. And this is a point where we can make an offset for the movement. So let's say something like -3. Play the animation and you will see our breaker object is a little bit behind our inflow object. Just increase this number or decrease in this case and say -5, and you will see it's behind our sphere. So both are a little bit too big, I would say. We can scale them both a little bit more down and bring that in a good position. And I will delay path 2 a little bit more, -7, so that it's clearly behind our inflow object, and that looks good. I would say that will work for our scene. Okay, so I would say we prepared our scene here. It's a good time to save it. I already have saved it as a splash along path.blend. Choose a name, whatever you want. And now it's time to prepare the simulation of the fluids. So what we need, of course, is a domain object. So while the can is selected, I say Shift S, snap cursor to selected, because I want to be on the middle of this. Shift A, mesh cube, and scale it a little bit bigger. One note here is, this is our domain, and we have some limits here on the sides. This is our domain boxes. And take care, because when the fluids are flying around and you don't want to see in your final rendering that some drops are hitting the walls of the domain object, that it is scaled big enough. So I would say try something like this, and then I'm going to enable flip fluids, make that one and do a domain object here. Okay, and I'll place it here so that our main object is exactly in the middle. I will scale it some bigger. And I would say that is a good point to start. So we have a domain object, we have our can here, our path and anything else. So we need, of course, some objects for fluids. So this is our inflow object. It's parented to path 1, so we need to open it in the out viewer here. And we need to make that a flip fluid inflow object. and there's some quick motion. Sometimes I recommend to use some sub-steps. So let's say something like 10. So if you have a really fast moving inflow, where you generally would look like it's stuttering or stepping or something like this, the sub-step emissions would mean that the Flip Fluids add-on will calculate some frames between. So you have a smoother motion. I would recommend to enable the checkbox for export animated mesh here. And yes, we have to keyframe that enables checkbox here, because let's say your animation is longer than 250 frames, and when the inflow object comes to the endpoint, you don't want that it continues emitting fluids. So at this point, it would mean we have to disable emitting. So while on the last frame, we can uncheck that box here, press I while the mouse cursor is on top of this, press I, what sets a keyframe, and let's jump one frame back and enable it and set a new keyframe, press I, and now when you go through your animation, you will see that this keyframe is animated. So we have fluids emission all the time here, and at frame 250 our simulation will stop to emit fluids at this point. Alright, so the inflow has been set up. Let's go to the obstacle, to our breaker object. One interesting thing is here, I found out it would be good to edit this a little bit. So what we can do is, let's scale it a little bit to make it look flat, or more flat like this. And in edit mode, we could also choose some points. Let's say this one, G, Y, Y, and bring it here. Make that on the other side, G, Y, Y, and move it here. So it looks a little bit like wings, and this will give us a better look for breaking the fluid surface. Alright, so this is our obstacle. That means Flip Fluids obstacle, and make sure you have enabled the export animated mesh checkbox here too, what is really important. The other stuff is okay like it is. Of course, our can is obstacle too. So I would say all of your base model mesh should be obstacles. As there's no animation for this obstacle, it's not required to change anything here. Just tell the simulator that that is an obstacle. Okay, so that has been finished yet. So we have our obstacles, we have an inflow, we have a domain. That means we are going to make some settings here while the domain is selected. I would say we will simulate with resolution of 300. Preview resolution could be something like 150 to have a faster real-time playback for previewing. Frame rate is absolutely okay. Let's take a look. The cache will automatically be named to your Blender file's name. Really good. Display settings, nothing to change here. The surface, really important. I want to have 2 subdivisions because this will avoid flickering of the fluid surface. Maybe subdivisions 1 will work too, but by typing in a 2, we'll be sure it will work correctly. So nothing more to set up here. Whitewater, we do not need Whitewater. The Flip Fluids word, I would say as a can in the real world is really small. And you see a calculated size of our scene is 25 meters. We can enable the checkbox here and scale it down to something like 0.2 an example. And important now is the scene's gravity, because when our fluids are flying around in real time, yes, it's fast as rain or as raindrops, and we want to have something like slow motion. And I found out when we are going to decrease the speed here, we have slow motion, of course, but the fluids will be a little bit more unstable, and yes, it's going to flicker. So we are going to change the scene's gravity. From scene, switch to custom, and then choose the Z value here. And I want to have a pretty small upwards motion, but really small value. So type in something like 0.00001, an example. When you hit enter, you might see this. It looks like the add-on just have a 0 inside, but just click one more time on it and you will see the 1 on the end of your line here has been saved. So this will work. It's okay. So, all right, we don't use a preset here. We are going to make an own. And yes, so I would say it is a good point to start a simulation. Just save the file again. And let's have a first look to what that will look like by hitting on bake. You see the motion has been exported and the simulator starts to simulate. It will calculate the remaining time. So let's have a look how this will look like. Okay, I have just waited the simulator to finish about 30 frames, and now let's have a look how the simulation is looking like. And we see there are no drops flying around here or something else. Something I really love in this add-on is it's still in simulation progress and we can work with our scene. So while baking this in progress, we can change things or add things or whatever, prepare rendering, an example. But first thing is we want to have a look how the actual simulation progress is looking like. Of course, if this took too long for you, you can choose a lower resolution for the first preview, something like we have, let's say 150 or 200, and increase the resolution for the final simulation process. So, but 300 is fine for me, and as we can see, nothing is flying around here. That might be. Let's take a look on the left side here. I have Flip Fluids Panel 2. This is something like the helper add-on from the fracture modifier, and I can switch to preview mode and load a new frame to make sure that what I have seen here is not a preview, it's the final. And you can switch here. That is really cool, but this is for sure this is the final result, and I don't see anything flying around here. And this is because as you can see, the fluids breaker is completely inside our fluid surface, so there's no chance to break it in a way we would love to see. And what is required to do is we could make the inflow a little bit smaller, or we make the fluids breaker a little bit bigger, or we choose to make both. Now I'm going to stop the simulation, and I'm going to make the breaker object a little bit bigger. So I will select it, press S on the keyboard and scale it bigger so I can see the, let's call it, wings outside of our inflow. Okay, and let's wait the simulator to finish stopping here. All right, so I can hit now reset to delete the simulation, and now I make the inflow object a little bit smaller, so we have this here. Okay. Let's fix this a little bit here. So it's not required that it is really on top of the path, or that the front of our fluids breaker is always looking forward. When it's rotating a little bit, that might not be a problem. Okay, so with this little corrections, I'm going to save the scene first, and then while the domain object is selected, I'm going to bake again and then take a look what happens. Alright, the second preview has been rendered for 30 frames and I'm going to take a look how this is looking like. So I'll play Alt and A, and as I can see, it starts to break the surface here, like in the way we would love to see, or you just have seen in the animation in the beginning of this tutorial. So I would say I can continue baking here. I don't want to break it, and I think it's not required to change anything else here. Of course, if your scene needs some perfection, you should change the things like you want and then rebake, and yes, try to go. And we are going to continue now with our scene setup. So of course we need to give the fluids a material. So I would say let's do it in the rendered preview, and it's just white, and we do not need white fluids. So select the fluid surface, and you will find it in the domain cube here, fluid surface, and add a new material, and we can use glass or principled shader or whatever you want. I'm going to use glass, and it still looks fantastic, but I'm going to give it a little bit color. It could be something that matches your object, an example. So that means for me orange or blue. Or let me try something here, slide it around here, or a little bit violet. Violet is beautiful too. Something like this, blue, a little bit more red in this blue. I don't know, I would say something like this. Something like this could be look very good. And what you will notice is the fluid is very thick and the drops will be very big. And a trick to make fluids more thinner and bubbles or drops smaller is to go to the modifier tabs and add smoothing to it. So choose this one here, smooth, and increase the values very high. So say number 2 and repeat 8 times. Now it's looking like this. You can switch it off for preview and see the difference here. That will increase the quality of our rendering really a lot, and you will love it. Let's make 2.5 here. And while the fluid surface is selected, press select and shade smooth also. So this will look perfect. All right, and what we can do also is when you press 0 on your numpad here, you'll see we see the background yet. Okay, this is because this is our environment texture, and of course we see it here. But when you go to the words tab and take a look to ray visibility, you can disable camera, and then our HDRI texture is only visible in everything else in the camera. Means glossy, transmission, all you can see here. And that would mean we have a black background. Of course, that would be great if you are going to render this on an alpha channel to replace the background at a later time, but we are going to animate our camera, and that would mean a static background is wrong. And I had a good idea to have a very interesting and good looking background here, and this is add a UV sphere and size it very big so that we are inside it. And this is our this is the environment that is visible only for the camera, but not in reflections and so on. So first shade it smooth so it looks really beautiful, and we're going to give it a new material. Say it's world visible in example visible. So that is what we can do here, and go to the objects tab and cycle settings, and then we will disable glossy, transmission, yes, and the other stuff is okay. That means that tells cycles that this word will only be visible for the camera and in some diffuse reflections or something like this, but we will not see it in the reflections of our object here. And we will not see it in the glossy channels of our fluid surface or any other glossy or refractive material. So take a look how this is. Look in the rendered preview. Yes, it's too dark now. So disable diffuse, and this is what we have now here. We can rotate, and the problem is that we are outside of our camera yet. So we are outside of our sphere here. Let's go inside again. And what we can do is, let's see where our fluids are. I'm sorry. Okay, it's here. Let me bring the camera to the other side. So while the sphere is selected, I can also maximum draw type here on the display. Change to bounce or wire if you want. So we can have a look through it. But I want to take the camera and move it to the other side where our fluids are going. Rotate it 180 degrees and press 0 again to fly in through it, into it, and so we have the render preview. And now we can our fluids here. And why did I do this? This is because I want our visible environment sphere material color to match a little bit more our fluid surface color. So let's go to color. And as you can see, you can change the background color here. And let's make it a little bit more blue, reddish, orange, I don't know. Make it colorful. Yes, this is very experimental. You can do it whatever. You can do whatever you like. And of course, you can choose to make it a little bit darker, in example. So your main objects will pop a little bit more to the foreground, and yes, I would say it looks pretty good. That's what I like. Okay, so this is one thing, and another thing is I'm going to select all my main objects meshes and rotate it R, Z along the Z axis to have a correct front view for me. Something like, oh, let's say something like this here. And we could add an empty. So add empty plane axis and place it correctly into the middle. It is. Scale it a little bit bigger to make it visible. So the empty, and call this empty DOF. Yes, depth of field, because we are going to make some depth of field for our scene. Go back to the camera and select the camera. Go to the camera tab here, and then you can open the depth of field here and choose our DOF object. That means the camera will focus to this object, and let's say it's an aperture size. I think we can choose a very low value, something like 0.1. So click on render preview. Yes. Okay. How good the depth of field is working, you can see in the background. As this is really washing out, and later the time when the simulation has been finished and the drops are flying around, you will see that drops that are near the camera or that are more far away from the camera will blur out too. And that looks more realistic, like recorded with a real camera. Okay, so I would say this setup has been finished. I'm sure the final rendering will look good, or the final simulation. Let's prepare the scene a little bit more. So for rendering, so we have our dimensions. I want to render with full HD, 25 frames per second. Okay, metadata not required. Output. This is my standard folder where I render things to. Let's call the files splash flying in example. I'm going to render as image sequence, and that is something I highly recommend to all you, because if something happens, the energy goes away from your home, or Blender breaks or crashes, whatever, you can continue rendering from the last rendered frame. And that is not possible if you save your rendering in one video file. So always use image sequences and use any video sequencer software to make a video from the sequence. So RGBA would mean if you use an alpha channel, but we don't have an alpha channel in our scene, we have a custom background, so RGB is enough. And I will use the best compression. 100% means maximum lossless compression with slow file output. That means we will have really good quality here, and that is enough. So let me close it here. Sampling. I would say 500 samples will be enough for us here. To boost a little bit the speed of rendering, we can use for clamp indirect a high value, something like 1. What exactly these settings mean, you should take a look on the web. Geometry, it's nothing to change here. Light paths, we are going full global illumination. Filter glossy, this will eliminate some fireflies. So try 0.75 here. Motion blur, not for this scene because the fluids are moving very slow. Motion blur does not make sense here. If you have a fast motion, then you should use motion blur, and you will find some information about flip fluids and motion blur on the web. And the other stuff I think is okay as it is. Performance, no post-processing required here. So this is looking good. And what I finally am going to do is in the scene step here, I'm going to use the denoiser. Oh, no, it's here, the scene tabs. I'm going to use the denoiser, open it, denoise, and I want to have good quality, not too strength, not that the strength is too high. So I'll set a radius of 5 and say 0.3 here and say 0.3 here. So of course, while simulation is going on, we can save our file now. So I recommend to save the file always on the first frame, because saving means the actual state of the simulation or the simulation's mesh will be saved too, and that makes your file bigger. So jump to the first frame and save your file. And let's go on. Let's see where we are here. That's the last I have. So let's take a look how one rendered image will look. I press F12 and rendering begins here. So far very good. You see the denoiser did a good job, and that is a very good quality, and I rendered that one frame in 1 minute and 6 seconds on my 1080 Ti from NVIDIA. And yes, I think that looks very good. I could make the background a little bit more blue and maybe a little bit more bright. Make it a little bit more bright and a little bit more blue. Yes, this is something I will like. Okay, so this depends on what you like. Okay, and finally I'm going to make animation for our camera, and make sure your cursor is snapped to the middle. So let's say that it's empty, so Shift S, cursor to selected, and then Shift A, and add a circle and scale that circle big enough. And this is a circle where our camera will move on. So go to the top view. Let's hide the outer world only for the preview here. Click on the eye. While the camera is enabled, that means in rendering the background will be visible. Okay, so back to our circle. Bezier circle. Let's call it cam pass an example, and you can scale it like you want. And Now select the camera, press Shift on your keyboard and select your camera path and press Ctrl P, and then you can choose follow path again, and just press Alt A and you will see the camera is moving around. And like with the other follow path modifier, you will see while the path is selected, you go here and you can choose a higher value for the frames here. Let's say 250 would mean the camera will fly around 360 degrees in 250 frames. Let's go inside the camera. I would say it's too fast. For me, it's too fast. So I say 500. Yes, the scene is not 500 frames, so at 250 frames the camera will stop, and that means we will have half of the motion. But I think that looks good. That looks good. You will see all the fluid drops flying around here. Let's make it 550, so it's not too fast. And we can, while the path is selected, scale it. And if you want to be a little bit creative, you can rotate it also. So something like this, an example, and then you'll see it will fly around in a creative way. Yes, I think this is something we will love. Okay, I jump back to frame number 1. Yes, you see the background image here, but it will not be rendered, as we told Cycles to not render it for the camera. This is just for your preview here. What I'm going to do now is press once again save. And what is really cool now is, let's have a look to the simulation process. And as you have seen, rendering took about 1 minute and 6 seconds for a frame where not that much fluid is inside. But let's say we would be at frame 150, an example, then you will have more fluids around here, and that would mean rendering our frame will take a little bit longer. So it might be something around 2 minutes. I expect that could be realistic. And I think when rendering one frame will take longer than simulating one frame, that would mean you can start to render your animation while simulation is in progress. And that is a real time saver, because when the simulation progress has been finished, you have a finished rendering. And this is really cool. But take care, if rendering is a little bit faster, you will maybe have crashes or something will go wrong or whatever. So that depends on your calculation. But this is what I'm going to do now. We have prepared everything. I will hit render, and then I think we have finished with this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe my channel. There will become a lot of more from fluids and of course for the fracture modifier. And I would love to see your results from this tutorial. See you the next time, guys. One thing I forgot to tell you. One thing, I'm sorry. The last thing is, we have to hide this object here for rendering. That's all. Sorry guys, see you the next time. Goodbye.